Welcome to the other side of Lucy Letby. We're going to finish off BBC with the evidence of Dr. Sandy Bohan. So again, this is taken from the Total Life website, link in the description. Independent medical expert Dr. Sandy Bohan has returned to court this time for BBC. Dr. Bohan confirms, after being asked by Mr. Johnson, that she had received and reviewed the case evidence, including from doctors' witness statements. Dr. Bohan says her role was not to rubber stamp anything, but to come to her own conclusions and see whether they agreed with that of Dr. Evans. Again, I find that a bit of a strange statement. She was saying that she wasn't to rubber stamp anything, but she was to agree or disagree only with Dr. Evans, not with any of the other experts. That's how I read that. She said she set out what she thought were the important facts for BBC. They include an X-ray taken on June 12th, following the insertion of a long line. She noted the long line was in a low position, but a stable position. The stomach looked swollen and had a distended bowel. So we know that this X-ray was taken on the 12th and that it showed this distension of the bowel, which the attending doctor attributed to CPAP belly. Dr. Bohan is asked about her conclusion regarding BBC. She said it was known BBC was premature and growth restricted and potentially at risk of complications, but managed very well indeed in his early days, improving to being put on Optiflow. So there's the party line. The fact that you're put on Optiflow means you have improved. And I think we've already pointed out that, and we will provide some citations that that is not actually true. He has clearly not liked being on CPAP and had been put on skin-to-skin contact with his parents without CPAP for a couple of hours and had done well during those times. So we're into this thing here again, the fact that the kangaroo care, again, was a sign of stability. Kangaroo care was a therapeutic choice. And we remember that when the baby was switched to Optiflow, which was oxygen, still pressurized, but not as predictably, the blood gases immediately deteriorated. Now, these things don't seem to concern Dr. Bohan at the minute. But then Dr. Bohan is a neonatologist, and I'm not, so perhaps that's the difference. And then Dr. Bohan goes on to say, this was not a baby who was ill. This was a baby who was improving. So again, without any expert witness to contradict that, I certainly don't agree with it. Dr. Bohan noted child C clearly had an infection, but this was not a baby who was ill, which was an alerting feature for which the medical team treated him with antibiotics and did an X-ray confirming left lung pneumonia. So left lung pneumonia confirmed by X-ray in a baby, we have to understand, that is not ill. That's what the jury was told. Despite that, BBC had appeared to respond to treatment due to the lessening of respiratory support. So again, due to the lessening of respiratory support means the step down to Optiflow. We are not given any, or in the public record, we don't have any sequence of blood gas analyses. And anywhere we've already talked about the limitations of blood gas analyses when they're done with capillary testing and when they're done with oximetry. So again, there's cause for doubt in this. BBC's breathing rate was very stable despite effectively breathing with one lung. So we have Dr. Bohan saying this was not an ill baby, but it was breathing with one lung. Dr. Bowen's conclusion was that he had pneumonia, but that did not cause the collapse or kill him. So, can pneumonia cause a collapse, a sudden collapse, and die in an 800-gram neonate that's 30 weeks gestation? Absolutely, it can. Dr. Bowen said pneumonia would be a factor in the difficulties in response to resuscitation. So in that situation, then the failure to respond to resuscitation, which is, as we know, part of the golden thread, is nullified in this case because the baby, according to Dr. Bowen, effectively only had one lung. She tells the court there would be a sign something was amiss prior to the collapse, and a sudden unexpected collapse would be uncommon in babies. Okay, so we'll look at that. Dr. Bowen says babies on CPAP can have CPAP belly, and in order to minimise that, they would aspirate the NGT, the nasogastric tube. It is usual practice to note down the volumes of air aspirated to give colleagues an idea of how much air is coming out of the baby. I couldn't find any evidence of that in the notes. So we don't know how much air was coming out of the baby, but Dr. Evans seems to know that without having to have it measured. She adds that for babies not fed, the nursing staff would put a tube on free drainage so air could come out on its own, as well as actively aspirate it. That's draw out the air every 4 hours or so. She says there was only a fleeting mention of free drainage. So the notes are not really describing the proper management of CPAP belly. Is that what she's suggesting? I don't know. Dr. Bowen says that it was not clear from the notes how long the free drainage was in place. So from the notes, never mind the court transcript, from the notes, it's not clear how long it's not clear how long the staff used the advised free drainage of air to improve that condition. She said one conclusion for BBC's collapse was CPAP accumulation of air, the other being deliberate injection of air. So again, that's one conclusion was CPAP, and the other was deliberate injection. So how, if that was the case, if that was the only two causes of the collapse in this baby mentioned so far, and everything else ruled out as a cause of collapse, how can we distinguish one from the other? She said doctors did not appear to have a concern as they had noted the abdomen to be soft. So is a soft abdomen a good sign that CPAP belly is not an issue, or that any medical condition in a preterm neonate is not an issue? No, it's not. Dr. Bowen said BBC died with pneumonia, not because of pneumonia. Well, we have to remember that the pathology report said lung disease. So this baby had a respiratory distress syndrome, almost certainly had what's called atelectasis, which is little collapses of the lung, and that could also have been present in the one good lung that was functioning, and the baby had pneumonia. So the detailed postnatal report would include, I'm certain, would include details of all of that. And even if the pathologist did not say that pneumonia was the direct cause of death, he did include it in lung disease as a cause of death. We have the list of the lung diseases. Pneumonia is one of them. Lung diseases cause death. Pneumonia, therefore, caused death, along with other lung diseases. She said, babies such as BBC do not collapse suddenly and without warning. And again, that is not true. She said an infection would not be the cause, as that would lead to a gradual deterioration in the baby not a sudden collapse with no response to such. She said an infection would not be the cause, as that would lead to a gradual deterioration in the baby, not a sudden collapse and no response to resuscitation. But she has already told us that the fact that the baby had only one lung functioning did interfere with resuscitation. And then there's no live reporting for the remainder of Dr. Bowen's testimony, and the below is taken from the Chester Standard Daily Roundup. Giving evidence, medical expert witness Dr. Sandy Bowen said BBC was potentially at risk of complications after birth. Well, he wasn't potentially at risk. He was subject to the risk. But she told the court, actually, in the early days, he managed very well indeed. A couple of times he had skin-to-skin contact with his parents, and that is something you would not do if you had concerns. And again, in developing countries all over the world, this is done on a daily basis, whether you have concerns or not. He was not only doing well, but was actually improving, and was not a baby who was ill. So we get to the point where we really seriously need an expert witness for the defence to put to the jury just how ill baby C was. She agreed baby C developed pneumonia, but said he received the standard treatment of antibiotics. Well, they don't always work, particularly if we're dealing with a nosocomial or a hospital-acquired infection. They very often don't work. Dr. Bowen said, my conclusion was yes, he had pneumonia, but that was not what caused him to collapse. I think the pneumonia contributed to not surviving resuscitation. Asked to explain a buildup of gas in baby C's abdomen detected on X-ray on June the 12th, the day before his fatal collapse. Now, remember, that's the day that Letby wasn't there, that the doctor present diagnosed CPAP belly, and that Dr. Bowen had since confirmed there was no indication of routine management of that CPAP belly. Dr. Bowen said air could have accumulated via respiratory support he was receiving. The alternative explanation is the deliberate introduction of air down a fitted nasogastric tube. Also, another explanation could be the application of air by a small gas of compressed air, which Letby stole into work in her Ibiza bag. Oh no, she hadn't been to Ibiza yet. But yet, you could buy small aerosols of compressed air, and that would have been a much more effective way of getting air down into a nasogastric tube. But because the judge said we didn't really need to think about those things, we just needed to consider what these people said, not the likelihood or the possibilities or the impracticalities or the fact that no one witnessed Letby pulling off this amazing stunt of putting air down a 2 mil, very, very thin-walled nasogastric tube that apparently wasn't even in the right place. So I think we should add the use of a canister of compressed air into there as well, because I think it's feasible. We can't rule it out. And then she goes on to say, you get prior warning before collapses. They don't go from being stable into a cardiopulmonary situation within minutes. They rarely collapse in this way. Oh, so they rarely collapse in this way. So that means they sometimes collapse in this way. But they are usually responsive to resuscitation, and he was not. But we know that you've already said that he was not responsive to resuscitation because he only had one lung. So again, this is a situation where we have an expert witness arguing with themselves. Mr. Johnson says, in your view, did the infection that BBC had, was that the cause of the catastrophic collapse? Dr. Bowen, I think he died with his pneumonia, not because of his pneumonia. And again, we're on to this. He died from lung disease He died from ischemic heart disease caused by lung disease, and pneumonia is a lung disease. So it's one of the few or many that he had. Ben Myers, QC, defending, noted BBC's markers for infection in the last 24 hours of his life. The blood platelet count fell below acceptable levels. Oh, his weight was low and he had not been fed, he said. Notes were also recorded of dark bile being produced and an incident of vomiting with bile he had it. Mr. Myers asked, if you put these things together, they might be a matter of concern. Dr. Bowen said, I say they were not. So putting all those things together, the weight loss, the thrombocytopenia, that's the low platelet count, the vomiting, the bile, when you put all those things together, Dr. Bowen said they were not a matter for concern. And Mr. Myers went on to say, it's not a question of you minimising the seriousness of BBC's condition, is it? Absolutely not, said Dr. Bowen. So let's just have a little look at some of the claims made by Dr. Bowen in this testimony and put it against the literature and see what we come up with. Let's look at one of these things here, the thrombocytopenia, which is the fall in the platelet counts. Now, we know that Ben Myers, defending, said to Dr. Bowen that BBC's markers for infection rose in the last 24 hours of his life. Well, they are not necessarily markers for infection. They're markers for inflammation. And then he goes on to say that his blood platelet count fell below acceptable levels. Platelet levels below 50 would be a general cause for concern. Again, with neonatal medicine, there are a lot of ifs and buts. But the problem is not necessarily the number. It's also what is going along with the number. Because the causes of the platelets falling are early and late onset sepsis, necrotizing enterocolitis, this mysterious illness that preterm babies get, birth asphyxia, chronic intrauterine hypoxia, which we know that this little baby probably suffered from, placental insufficiency, and things like preeclampsia in the mother. And it can also be due to an immature bone marrow function in the babies, which means also that the white cells, even though the number might be okay, the white cells themselves that fight the infection may not be mature enough to fight the infection. So the timing of the thrombocytopenia is also an issue too. So the early onset, that's within 72 hours of life, so that would include this baby. But the fall of platelets in conditions like sepsis, NAC, and intraventricular hemorrhaging, which there's been no mention of in this case, but I'm pretty sure will be present. Thrombocytopenia can lead to an increase in mortality in all of these babies. Let's not forget that we didn't discuss during the Letby trial, because we had no expert to discuss it, that the leak report showing the Pseudomonas aerugiosa colonised taps in the nurseries in the neonatal unit during the time period when Letby was convicted. And this is known to be lethal to vulnerable babies. It's an environmental organism that thrives in moist conditions and usually colonises hospital water systems. And the bacteria infection problem in the unit weren't mentioned during the trial or in the 2017 report from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. There were major plumbing issues, sewage coming up through the floor, sewage coming through the taps. It is hard to believe that knowledge of this would not have had an impact on at least some of the jurors. And if you're an expert in giving a report, we don't know whether Dr. Bowen or Dr. Evans knew about this contamination. We don't know. But when you answer a question that Mr. Myers put to Dr. Bowen, but again, didn't have an expert to back up the points that he was making, the markers for infection or inflammation rose in the last 24 hours of life. Platelet count fallen, body weight fallen. And then he says, if you put these things together, they might be a matter for concern. And Dr. Bowen says, I say they were not. And I, as a generalist and someone who worked on neonatal units a long time ago, would say there are issues not only of concern, but of grave concern. So we'll get on to Professor Owen Arthurs. So he's the radiologist, and he's given evidence in relation to baby C and to baby D. So Nicholas Johnson, the prosecutor, of course, gets the first go because it's his witness, asks about baby C specifically. And pictures are shown in court. The first is a radiograph, an X-ray image of baby C taken on June the 10th. He points out that baby C is small and can almost fit entirely on one X-ray image. The X-rays were taken to check for the position of a UVC. And we know that there are serious limitations in X-rays to make any kind of diagnosis, particularly when you're doing just one X-ray and you're not doing sidelong images, top-down images, that kind of thing. I referenced some of the papers that Professor Owens has written himself about the use of X-rays in post-mortem analysis of babies. And the main thing in all of the papers that Professor Owens has written, and the main takeaway from all the papers authored over the years, is the lack of any information about X-rays, because he talks specifically about much more sophisticated methods to determine post-mortem findings in babies. He goes on to say here, but the tube was brought in a little too far and should be brought back a little. And then he says what I've been saying. He says the problem with X-rays is that they are 2D images of a 3D person. So there is difficulty with interpreting the picture without the baby in front of you. Well, so actually admitting himself the limitations of X-rays, because they're two-dimensional, not three-dimensional. Yet a human body is three-dimensional. And this would have been a perfect opportunity to have another radiologist there to explain all that in detail. Another X-ray of baby C is shown, and it was taken at 10:38 p.m. and it shows that the line was withdrawn and that there was normal gas in the stomach and bowel. So this is all on the 10th. He says the most striking abnormality in the right is the right lung on the image. The left lung, from the child's perspective, is white, meaning there is something in the lung preventing the X-rays passing through, which would indicate an infection. But it's white. It's what we used to call a whiteout in the lung. It's severe infection. No little pockets of gas in the middle of it, a complete whiteout. Then he talks about an image, a further X-ray image is shown for baby C on June the 12th at 12:30 in the afternoon, which is centered on the baby's abdomen. He says the most striking feature about this image is the dilatation of the stomach, which is full of gas. He says this is more gas in the stomach than you would expect for a child of this age. There was a small tube in the stomach taking out air, The left lung cannot be seen on this X-ray image. So we do 2 X-rays to check for the position of umbilical venous line, but we only do 1 X-ray to check for the destruction of the lung. Professor Arthur says, for his conclusion for BBC, that the marked gas dilatation in the stomach on June the 12th had several potential causes, including CPAP belly, sepsis, neck, or exogenous administration of air by someone. An observation was made that there was no gas in the rectum area for BBC. But again, we have to say, Lucy Letby wasn't working on the 12th of June. So would we not call this major piece of evidence by Professor Arthur's marked gas dilatation in the stomach, potentially administered by someone else, would we not call that an event in this series, or does it get relegated to a non-event because Lucy Letby wasn't on? It's a reasonable question. Then the cross-examination goes on. He agrees that the left lung infection is a significant factor from the first image. He says the second image has a possibility of gas in the bowel wall, which is a possibility of neck. He says as far as he knows, no necrotizing enterocolitis was found in BBC. Well, it wasn't mentioned, certainly in the limited post-mortem report that we have. And Mr. Myers said BBC at 4 days old did not have his bowels open, and bowel obstruction could be considered. Professor Arthurs, asked by the prosecution about a bowel obstruction, says if the bowel was blocked at a particular point, it would give a marker as to where the obstruction was. He says the image showed no such marker, and as bowel obstruction are a common clinical occurrence, it would be diagnosed and babies would go to theatre for an operation in an ideal world. He says there is no evidence of a bowel obstruction on the imaging, on the clinical notes, or in the autopsy. And he refers to the possibility of a twisted bowel, which he says can happen in small babies as a result of a blockage. He says that is often a surgical emergency and will be documented as such and found post-mortem if there is such a finding. And then we go on finally to Dr. Marnarides, and he gave his opinion on the cause of death after having reviewed the pathological evidence as well as information received from clinical and radiological reviews. BBC, a boy, was subject to an excessive injection of air into his nasogastric tube, he said. This is a pathologist now. Mr. Myers has taken the medic back over his evidence for BBC, BBT, and now BBI. So, again, we're all over the place. The defence lawyer is focusing the questions on the fact that he had to rely on Dr. Dowie Evans and other medics for his review. And Dr. Marnarides earlier said to discount the clinical evidence informing his reports was akin to asking someone to explain physics without using mathematics. It's quite easy to explain physics without using mathematics. It's done all the time. But the point that Myers is making is lost on the jury because he does not have a witness that can counteract what Dr. Marnarides is saying. So we'll just look at a few things here. Professor Arthur said that obstruction of the bowel would show up at a post-mortem. But the fact is that, while some cases of bowel obstruction would show up in an autopsy, not all cases, maybe always, especially in preterm infants, because the pathology changes associated with bowel obstruction can vary in severity and are not always clearly distinguishable from other conditions that affect premature infants. And this is the general problem with these autopsies on these very, very vulnerable and poorly developed babies. Some obstructions may resolve before death, may not be progressed to the point where they're causing obvious pathological changes. And just other complications in general. Sepsis, again, our old friend sepsis. Sepsis can obscure or alter typical pathological findings of bowel obstruction. The timing of the obstruction relative to the death and the autopsy can affect visibility and interpretation of the pathological changes. And again, timing is always an issue in postmortems. So there is doubt there, again, in what a radiologist said about the findings of a pathologist. Is this an example of a radiologist going outside his area of expertise? Again, I don't know. And what can we learn from the vast intellect that is Dr. Marnarides, a man who talks about preterm neonates on trampolines, preterm neonates in car crashes, and physics without mathematics? Well, we common folk, if we find an apple on the ground underneath an apple tree, we're going to know it fell, because of physics without any mathematics. And if we find an 800-gram baby who's lost 12.5% of its body weight and developed a whiteout pneumonia of an entire lung within 48 hours of birth, who's developed thrombocytopenia and failed all attempts to establish ventilation, we know that that baby died from what the pathologist said it died from: widespread hypoxic ischemic injury due to lung disease, not due to an injection of air into the stomach. If that's not true, we'll have to readjust our thinking and start looking for apples that fall up. We'll see you in the next episode when we start to examine the terrible fate of baby D. Bye.